Thank you for joining us. My name is Hanif Kara. I want to start by thanking Ellis, the Architecture Foundation, and Rosie for the wonderful 37 days and for inviting us to come back and finish what we started maybe 6 or 7 weeks ago. We have a slightly different format today. We have an esteemed panel, which is Mohsen Mostafavi, who is from Harvard and was encouraging in us starting the studio when we did. Kirsten Haggart, who's still trying to join us from Thistleton. Katerina Dionysopoulou from Bureau de Change. And Sam Jacob for being Sam Jacob. So these guys will join us just after we've done a 20 or 25-minute presentation. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So before we start, just as a group, we just want to acknowledge that this is a traumatic and emotional time for all Black people of the world, the family of George Floyd and others before him, and all Black lives matter to us. We wanted to continue, despite what's going on in the States where most of our students are, we wanted to continue as a mark of solidarity with our presentation, despite what's going on over there. Let's go to the first slide, please, Hiroshi. So you may have not been around for the last one, but basically we went into lockdown about 6 or 7 weeks ago and we jumped a scale. We went from presenting houses in the first part of the term to presenting a tower. So the students were given a scale jump, and the motivations behind that was really to still continue the architect engineer pedagogy in practice and to seek any balance between that and how we could create with that, to search for any big ideas in design that technology can serve rather than is technology. And the third motivation was really to even out the conversation about mass timber so that it's not stuck in the sanctuary of industry, which it is at the moment. So height defines towers. This is a mid-rise, as you can see. And what we picked was something that's already built between 72 meters and gave them the ambition of 120 meters, just for context. The Statue of Liberty, which is very appropriate, is 93 meters. And the tallest tree in the world, the redwoods in the Californian forests, are about 93 meters. So the Douglas firs grow about 60 meters. So we're not talking of a tower or a tall building. This is a mid-rise. Next, please. Our site is in Raleigh, Durham, very flat. And then in order to get something out in lockdown, we gave the students a chassis, which is just like a very quick primer of how the metrics of a tower works, so they wouldn't get stuck into this swamp, where we gave them an area and a site, as I said earlier, 14 different sites, and then some basic rules of thumb. Next, please. So we know that the architects get stuck in tall buildings, usually in the core and what the floor system is. And we wanted to avoid that. So students in our primer were given the basics of those so they could learn that or fast learn that and move on to the bigger ideas in design. Next, please. And the second thing they get stuck on is what does the wind do to a tall building? So the orange lines show you roughly where we are in our range of 70 to 100 meters. Basically, super tall and very tall buildings are a completely different kettle of fish to these. But one of the reasons for giving them these rules of thumb was so they could migrate from known systems in very tall buildings in steel and concrete and then reinterpret that to a lower height in building. Next. And the last thing I want to say before I hand over to Jennifer is that we managed to sneak in a visit to Sweden where we saw the 70-meter tall building that's being built in Skellefteå out of CLT. That is us and with all our students. And we also managed to go to Martinson's factory to have a look at how CLT is made. And this visit was very quick. It was just before the lockdown, but we learned a lot about the material so that we wouldn't get stuck on how to organize it. I'm going to hand over to Jennifer now.
Okay, thanks, Hanif. Hanif, Nelson, our TA, and I developed the studio around 4 conceptual underpinnings. The first questions the emergence of effects in recent architectural history and locates the design projects in the American South, while the other themes challenges the aesthetics of wood and what we are calling CLTBlanks. To start, if we think about the notion of effects, the moment when a strong pattern emerges within the discipline, we begin to label it, and it's regarded as a shift in paradigm. The Bilbao and Dubai effects come to mind as 2 effects around iconicity and gravity-defying skylines. A third effect can be dated to the 19th century, just after the Great Fire, labeled the Chicago effect. Currently, we see yet another pattern emerging with the architectural and structural advancement of mass timber, specifically in the Scandinavian countries where towers, housing, and cultural centers are marching forward in engineered wood at imaginable scales. So the students designed a house and tower, and here I think Mises' house and tower pairing is revelatory, with the house and tower share what looks like a similar structural solution in the column detailing, and we almost forget that there's such a significant difference in the height between the two. So we see this part as the pedagogical experiment from house to tower. Timber, a familiar material in Type 5 construction within the US, translates seamlessly into the single-family house, from wood framing on the left to cross-laminated timber panels on the right. CLT offers an alternative, as 2x6s are now laminated together into large panels with an overall reduction of construction time, factory precision for geometry, and now we have buildings with solid walls. So building mid-rise towers out of wood is counterintuitive, yet parallels the revolutionary thinking of structural steel. Here's the CLT blank. It's 3, 5, and 7 ply laminated panels. They're measuring 9 feet by 50 foot with endless possibilities for shape, geometry, and openings, which the students will define this through a variety of ways in the presentations. And lastly, we've asked the students in the studio to make a representational position around the aesthetics of wood. From IKEA's 2015 furniture collection to Sam Jacob's plank scarf for sale at 30 pounds, the image of wood is on trend. And Sam, this was our advertising pitch for you today. As contemporary artists grapple with real and fake imagery of wood, architects absorb the image of wood into contemporary interiors. We've asked the students to define the aesthetic of wood both as a representational device, but also as a tectonic question that hopefully becomes central to the positioning of each project. And so I think you're going to see 3 tendencies that have emerged within the studio. And these are, next slide, Hiroshi. These are projects that use the full-scale CLT blank as a strong image in the project. There's projects that deny the reading of the CLT blank, as well as a bunch of towers that begin with the material tectonic. And so next slide, these are the 7 houses that we mentioned and that we saw earlier on the 100-day studio. And this evening, next slide. We're going to present 7 projects, starting with Anna Kurtner, Calvin Boyd, Hiroshi Kaneko, Edgar Rodriguez, Ariane Kaligi, Anna Goga, and finally Benson Chen.
Hello everyone, I'm Anna and I'm originally from Germany, and my project is titled Scallop Tectonics. CLT has 2 dominant characteristics. It is a large sheet material, dimensions are limited by truck bed size, typically 9 by 50 feet, and it is structural. Secondly, because CLT is a manufactured material, it is inherently customizable during the production process. This customization is as equally controlled and precise as the material itself. The tower expands an exploration started in the house by developing a project which relies equally on the economy of the blank as the primary building block and the possibilities of CLT expression through the use of CNC technology to explore the volume and plasticity available in the thickness of the material. In the log roof and curved wall tested this. The grain of the vertical CLT walls in the house function both as structure and space. In the tower, the walls are doubled, pulled apart, and capped to create a hollow column. Used largely without modification, the CLT panel is modified only for the specifics of a doorway. But CLT can become a delicate and pliable material through the development of a unique CLT part. The curved wall, first explored for the house, is expanded to interlock and produce a continuous curved CLT wrapper for the tower. The tower uses a structural grain to produce space and differentiate two program types. The rotation of the grain creates a changing perimeter between each floor plan. And each type has a specific place within the stack so that loads are continuously transferred from stack to stack. The lot is located in the middle of our 2-block strip of experimental CLT towers. Instead of stratifying programs into different layers, each floor accommodates both office and residential. Different residential unit types are developed through the rotation in grain. Type 1 accommodates office, 2 1-bedrooms, 2 2-bedroom residential units. Type 2 creates larger residential units. Type 3, 2 types of units, and type 4, 4 units of equal size. And lastly, type 5, where on the ground floor and intermittently throughout the tower, the whole floor plate becomes a shared public program. The core and the wallums do the primary structural work. The facade picks up the load spanning from the last wallum to the slab edge. The floor plate rests on the facade and each chunk transfers this load to the next. The facade thickens as it carries more load towards the bottom of the tower. The 4 cores are made of 8 laminated 7-ply panels. Only 2 cuts are made. The wallums each use 3 blanks, requiring 21 per slab, which can be pre-assembled off-site. Each floor slab contains around 28 blanks. The curved wall is assembled into a large blank using identical 1-meter panels, which have been milled to fit a curve. Each assembled curve uses the equivalent of 2 to 8 blanks. Using the blank as a unit of measure registers the use of both standard blanks and custom panels. Typically, each floor uses around 49 standard panels, 7 custom panels, and 48 panels and 10 curves. The project attempts to use fully the economy of CLT through its scale and thickness, but also recognizes that the capacity of the material to be customized through the manufacturing process can produce new forms of connection and geometries to explore the expression of CLT. The facade belies the massiveness of its panels and the structural work they are doing. It heightens the compression and expansion of the curvature through its scalloped openings, rendering it plastic and light. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Next up, we have Calvin Boyd.
Hello, I'm Calvin Boyd, an MArch 1 student from Michigan, and this project is titled Notch, Slot, Step, Repeat, a CLT pegboard tower. To recap, for our midterm, I designed a CLT house based on what I consider to be the most recognizable symbol for home, the single-story gabled house. The house began as a single gable, but then split and duplicated into a larger structure with 3 more shed-style roofs, providing more space for the house's 10 occupants. Here, the single-story house can be seen cascading down the site while hovering over 2 floors encased in glass. Overall, the house seemingly floats in the landscape, but in actuality, it is supported by an interior CLT stair. This stair, composed of CLT walls and interlocking treads, not only acts as structure, but also serves as amenity space that divides the house in 2 and works to create a vertical public to private gradient. Transitioning to the tower, there was a specific effort to scale up the detail of the CLT stair. Rather than standard treads notching into walls, I questioned whether the tower's facade could serve as a pegboard for entire floor slabs to notch into. The tower, situated on plot 7, is located to the southwest corner of our collective site. In my initial massing studies, took advantage of this corner by designing a tower whose shape changed in the round. Furthermore, like the house, the studies all stepped in elevation and consisted of CLT vertical walls that floor slabs could notch into. This first animation shows how a potential CLT megaslab could be subdivided into 4-story stepping chunks consisting of CLT blanks. The second explores the location and number of potential notches, making sure to remove no more than 30 to 40% of the wall's volume for structural capacity. The third is a study on notch rotation and how their orientation affects the overall verticality of the CLT walls. All in all, over 20 unique elevations were designed, a study which I am calling a detour into CLT blank facadism. Structurally, the project's exterior walls support self-weight as well as some lateral and vertical loads, and all floors tie back to the project's core, where 70% of the vertical loads are taken. Additionally, the tower relies on shear walls rather than columns to support its floor slabs. At 120 meters tall, the tower is wooden and opaque in one direction, but glazed almost completely in the other. Programmatically, the tower is divided into both offices and housing. The offices occupy the lower portion of the tower and feature 2 large atria, while apartments occupy the higher terracing levels. Shown here are apartment floor plans with a mixture of 1 and 2 bedroom units. The plans are 36 by 36 meters and operate on a 6-meter grid. Next, these 2 plans are of an amenity floor, in this case a gym, and a typical office space. As mentioned before, residential units are divided into step chunks, and what makes this even more apparent are the color-coded window frames that lie recessed within the CLT exterior wall. Overall, the primary interest of this project was if methods of CLT tectonics and assembly could lead to more interesting and expressive building facade designs. And I can even imagine that re-envisioning towers as oversized CLT stairs could provide a more intuitive way to deal with zoning setbacks. Unlike the house, which exhibited an interior celebration of the CLT joint, this tower delights in exterior expressiveness by relocating this joint to the facade. Thank you.
Thank you, Calvin. I'm Horst Ganeko, and I'm from Portland, Oregon. This project is called Cutting Corners. Paper snowflakes are among many of the activities offered to us as children to teach us about symmetry, composition, transformation, and anticipation. A blank sheet of paper is folded, modulated by dull schoolhouse scissors, and is opened back up. The results are often mesmerizing. What structural system in architecture achieves this level of whimsy and fun? And what material might offer us a system free of a burdensome conscience, able to be put in the blue bin if a snip is aberrant or snips too much? And what a material might embed itself into our homes without question, as paper snowflakes do pinned to our refrigerator doors? Concrete gets close, but its plasticity relies on the discard of formwork, and its form, once set, becomes unalterable. The building block of paper, wood, is one such possibility. CLT takes on its position as the architectural equivalent of the paper necessary in classroom snowflakes. For the house, completed in the first half of the studio, paper was explored for its cut, fold, and prop characteristics. The metaphor of colored construction paper was used to create a house that used CLT like leaning paper sheets. Elements of vernacular architecture in North Carolina are exaggerated by propped elements. Cuts revealed windows, and lean-to panels provided resistance against shear forces. This tower employs a similar metaphor born from paper. Cut, fold, and propped is replaced by cutting corners. And it draws on the techniques of composition learned in school from our aforementioned paper metaphor, one by one, little by little, an expression in mass. Soft convex curves mimicking scissor cuts are scribed onto a grid. The grid cells are aggregated and the CLT blanks are fastened together with CLT structural fins, shown here with dashed lines. CLT is both represented as a unitized component as well as a material utilized for both local load distribution and lateral strength. Up close, the panels are an amalgam of conditions. The figures take on a graffiti-like appearance. The figures, as if filled by air, become textual and hieroglyphic. Cutting corners both literally and idiomatically gives way to an authorship unbound by textbooks. Less Mies van der Rohe, more Donnie White, less Frank Gehry, more Keith Haring. Atypical units suggest self and communal support, the possibility of lean on me aesthetics, and to graduate from our childhood metaphor, deviant structural flows. Moving away from the typical post and beam structure, the exterior facade is conceived of as a large pipe. Lateral loads are handled at the perimeter, allowing for an open core where office plates can be connected in section. Given the structural material needed to resist lateral loads, the larger and less punctuated figures resist the lighter, more punctuated figures above. A cultural program can occupy the less light-filled space near the base of the tower, while the offices above take advantage of more cuts and more light. The offices can then be aggregated by glyph size, allowing them to take full advantage of experiencing the figure glyphs in section and allowing the space to be leased sectionally rather than just in plan. The ground floor is occupied by a lobby and 2 retail spaces, and the floor plates up above take on the figural qualities of the facade, offering views to trays below and up above. Apertures on the facade take on unique qualities to reflect the individuality of each figure. From below, one can point and say, I'm in the square punch W, I'm near the figure 8 punched U, or I'm by the plus punched apostrophe. The objective as a studio has been to redefine, or rather define, an aesthetics of CLT. I'd like to suggest the possibility of radical figural gestures. This new mass is cross-pollinated with the fragility and diaphanous nature of paper. That medium explores kids without preconception. Thank you very much. Next up we have Edgar Rodriguez. Oh, Edgar, I think you might be on mute. Let's try that again. Okay, next up we have Edgar Rodriguez.
Still on mute, Edgar.
Yeah, okay. Now I think you can hear me, right? Can we start over, please? Okay, thanks. Hello, everyone. My name is Edgar Rodriguez, and my project is titled A Taller Pile of CLT. In this project, I explore the formal, spatial, and structural possibilities of the pile by taking the CLT panel as a starting point and interlocking them into a series of walls. Rooms are generated to allocate the program and give rigidity to the structure. The result is a compartmentalization of a singular open space. The first iteration of these ideas was explored in the design of a house, and they were further explored on the scale of the mid-rise tower with a total height of 125 meters. Two main concepts drive the aesthetic approach of the tower: anti-form, as described by Robert Morris in his homonymous article of 1968, and the fuzzy modularity of drying piles of lumber. Structurally, the tower relies on shear walls, and 80% of the lateral wind loads are taken by the two cores. The program is divided into three main sections: workspaces in the bottom third, followed by domestic space, and then lofts on the top third. On the ground floor, there is a lobby with common areas and a rooftop terrace on the top floor. The compartmentalization of the plan challenges the idea of the free plan in mass timber construction, from the segmented workspace plan to the rooms of domestic space. This pair of projects aims to give an architectural and spatial character to CLT and to reveal how it is different from traditional concrete or steel constructions. The regular plan strategy allows walls to move freely from floor to floor, giving the plan an infinite number of possible spatial configurations. Urbanistically, the tower meets the ground with a public plaza with oversized benches, and it is located in downtown Raleigh on the north end of Fayetteville Street, across the street from the North Carolina State Capitol. Going back to one of the strategies of the house, it's similar in a way in which the udukuri technique was used to decorate the roof of the house. A series of aluminum panels were designed to decorate the tower. A pixelated wood grain pattern is embossed onto the aluminum surface, and these panels are used as a cladding material on the underside of the tower's balconies. Overall, the tower embraces an industrial off-the-shelf aesthetic. Stainless steel railings, retractable window awnings, and aluminum window frames compose the building's final appearance. The pile, as I see it, accepts chance and implies indeterminacy, since replacing any unit would result in another configuration. This approach aims for the disengagement with preconceived forms and advocates for a unique expression of tall mass timber buildings. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Edgar. Next up, we have Aryan Kaligi.
Thank you, Hiroshi. Hi, my name is Aryan Khaligi. I'm from Tehran, Iran, and this is my project called Kissing Stack. The site is in downtown Raleigh, North Carolina, and the approximate dimension limit is 50 by 50 by 120 meters. The design is concerned with the complexity of the difficult whole, challenging the common monolithic mass of towers, which here is broken into parts, and the parts are merging into each other to find a comfortable position in a part-to-part relationship. Referencing cardboard architecture by Peter Eisenman and his interest in cardboard-like buildings, I studied the stacking of open cardboard boxes and extending this to timber box to investigate a novel stacking condition. Respecting the idea of kissing architecture introduced by Sylvia Lovin, the kissing parts in section accommodate residential and office cross-programming. The dimension of each part is determined by the dimension of a typical CLT blank mapped onto the elevation. The CLT blanks are grouped together on facade and some are folded inward to create aperture. The rotation degree depends on the program allocating wide aperture to residential units and narrow tall windows to the offices. The hybrid structure consists of two structural cores, perimeter load-bearing CLT blanks, and columns all working together to support vertical and lateral loads. A giant cross corbel in the bottom transfers the load to the ground. The facade is cladded with half-pipe shaped screen, which is competing with the massing. As the building parts get smaller upward, the cladding grain becomes coarser. The cladding is rendered with glittery saturated colors. A trendy car paint in America back in the 70s is reclaimed here. With a small footprint, a plaza is contributed to the city, sharing the ground level with the public. The sections exhibit the tower's engagement with the ground. It also shows the variation of the interior spaces, accommodating the need for cross-programming. The floor plans in 9 different levels are showing the contraction of the perimeter as the building elevates. On a typical residential floor plan, the units are aligned with the openings. This is the interior space of a residential unit where the tiles are aligned with and indexing the CLT top floor plates. In a typical office plan, there is a triple height space and 2 mezzanine levels. The narrow but tall openings deliver controlled daylight to the office space. Here again, we see the building on the skyline of Raleigh and next in eye-level view on the road. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you. Next up, we have Anna Goga.
Hi, my name is Anna Goga. I'm an architect from Moscow, Russia, and my project's name is 300 panels, 400 cuts, 400 bandages. The project starts with 2 simple operations made on a CLT panel, 1 squiggle cut and bandage of CLT pieces together. These operations originated from research on art practices on the one side and on the specificities of CLT construction on the other side. The idea of bandaging builds up on assemblage of pieces with explicitly introducing new materiality of a connection element used in artworks of Kishi Asuga. At the same time, the project rethinks the CLT construction element, or a steel plate, as it is called in the project bandage. The plates are commonly used to connect CLT panels and are carefully hidden under many layers. On the contrary, in my project, the steel plate becomes a main aesthetic element that shapes the building. Steel plates are designed, exposed, scaled, and exaggerated on purpose. My project starts by taking 300 panels, which are cut 400 times, and finally are banded with 400 steel plates. 300 cut and banded panels form a structural tube or the exoskeleton of the tower. On the outside, building becomes an exposed structure, explicitly embracing a CLT cut and its assemblage with using 400 steel plates. On the inside, the interior becomes a continuous monolithic wall, which is being disrupted by wavy window apertures. Structurally, the CLT cuts are connected with exaggerated in scale steel plates or bandages. Every 12 meters, structural belts are introduced to work both for compression and tension. The outside primary structure allows the inside to be relatively free of structural elements with the possibility to be reassembled. The building is divided in 4 zones, 25 meters tall. Each of them can be reassembled separately. The project rethinks the idea of lightness of the material and the afterlife of the building. This is one of the zones under the assemblage process. Cranes can move the panels and reassemble them to various combinations. Each zone seating is equipped with a gantry system with cranes that can move and reassemble panels inside the tower. If needed, extra panels can be loaded through the slots in the exoskeleton. Overall, the panels can be easily reassembled, allowing for a building to be customized and reassembled in the future into various compositions of floors and walls. For this project, I assembled the tower with first retail zone and 3 residential zones, with different combinations, but it can be many more. The tower is introduced to the context on a concrete plate, which becomes the foundation of the building. The touching the ground detail follows the same logic of panels assemblage. Steel plates are formally bending or patching the tower to the ground. The steel plates become the elements of public space as they detach from the tower. Overall, the tower thinks the aesthetic and structural possibilities of CLT panel and allows us to explore the opportunities of habitation of a CLT building through precise but yet very simple operations on a panel itself, cut and bandage. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Anna. And lastly, we have Benson Chen. Benson, I think we might have another case of muted microphone.
Sorry, I wasn't able to unmute myself. Can you hear me now? Hello, I'm Benson Chen from California, and this is Balloons and Booleans. In America, Type 5 construction comprises almost all suburban single-family homes. A sprawl of 2x4 stick frames, in contrast to CLTBlanks, coming as 3 m by 18 m panels. Openings are constrained to the frames, but CLT allows free cut and milling up to 40% of the surface area. By layering a series of 3-ply CLT in an enfilade, the CLT overlaps openings while creating structural integrity in the house. Distinct atmospheres are created depending on the direction of approach. The CLT McMansion is a series of marching walls, creating a house for a nuclear family of 10. And while the house looked at the kitsch of the American suburban front facade, the back looked at the chic by an open glass facade resembling an oversized balloon frame of CLT. And as we move to the tower and urbanity, the kitsch becomes a sprawl of the steel and glass towers, and the suburban facade becomes the chic. Moving from house to tower, the McMansion becomes a dense residential tower within the city. CLTBlanks are massive 3 m by 18 m sheets and can be used as structural walls and floors rather than becoming like typical steel and beam column towers. The blanks could be stacked and slotted on one another, then rotated on their center points. Rotating combinations of 2.5 or 5 degrees would be able to create a series of different unit types, market rate and affordable, separated by thick CLT structural walls. The walls are stacked and slotted into each other, then laterally braced with floor slabs, using over 1,000 CLT sheets. The vertical CLT blanks are slotted and nailed together, while horizontal blanks are connected by brackets. The facade clad in aluminum to subtly highlight the movement of the facade. The public library on the roof, the stack of residential, the amenities, pool, and park at the podium. The tower walls start at 750 millimeters at the ground level and taper towards the top from 600, 450, then 300. The building takes on 3 distinct facades, the CLT blank Boolean front, the balancing act of the walls on the side, and the balloon frame kitsch on the back. The enfilade piercing through the top of the clock tower library. The library levels highlighting the rotation and slotting of the walls. At the podium, the wall loads transfer from center point to end point. The transfer caught by the sharply rotated 750 millimeter layered CLT walls. The podium pool enfilade piercing through the thick rotating overlapping walls. So this starts to look at how CLT towers can start to express its unique identity within the urban sprawl of glass steel towers. Thank you for listening to all our presentations. We'd now like to open it back up to the panelists.
Just whilst the panel's thinking, Kirsten's joined us now. Welcome, Kirsten. Just one more thing to say is that we told the students to largely not get too involved with the ecological conversation or the fire conversation on the basis that both of these are knowns and they are being researched. So those are the only things we left behind technically. So it's all about big ideas. I will leave it up to whoever wants to start from the panel.
Yeah, Hanif, I just also want to add that, this was a studio that was co-taught between a structural engineer and architect. And so I think as an educational model, the students were able to fold both concepts into the projects. I think that's also up for discussion. And then you see they've placed a couple of images of each project, and they're happy to return to any images that you guys want to look at.
So Jennifer, maybe I can just say one thing, which is that I saw the first part, at least fairly briefly, and I just want to really congratulate you guys and the students for presenting a set of projects that are really clear in terms of their various stages. And I think for these projects to have been done during such a sort of complex time, it's really commendable. I know that the students have already had a review of these projects, so I'm sure for us it would be quite interesting to know what are some of the thoughts that they have in terms of topics or issues that they would like to continue from the review. But just to get us going, one thing that I would say is that it's actually amazing to see what is possible in a way, working with Zoom and working remotely. I suppose on one level, this has allowed the students and the team to know more about each other's work than they would normally. Because I think when we're working in the context of the studio, everybody is focusing on their own projects. And even with the final review, you don't get to discover this level of detail about each other's work. So I think there is something very positive about this experience. But I can also think of a number of critical issues, problematic things that education during this pandemic era is not always of equal value for everybody. And that it must be very difficult, for example, for people who don't find themselves with the right kind of space, freedom, quiet space to be able to do this work. So there are pros and cons that we can discuss about the role of architectural education during such a lockdown. There's a lot more for us to chat about, but I'll just leave it on that for now. Thanks.
I think it's really interesting, Hanif, the comment that you made right at the end, is to take the ecological and its sort of story off the agenda in terms of the work being presented, which makes it really interesting. Like, I really enjoyed seeing the kind of ways in which you all were kind of looking for what an expression of CLT construction might be. And Jennifer, I know, like, it's sort of they're definitely an interest of yours, and in your projects too. And there's some things which just struck me really. Like, first of all, like in some of your projects, there were moments where you get this idea that because it's in a way so simple, it comes in a big sheet and you cut it and then you like stick it together and that's it. There's a kind of like almost inherent relationship to the architectural model, and in that there's a certain kind of abstraction. Some thinking, like most obviously, Calvin, in your kind of cut out like typical cartoon house, for example, which strangely, when it becomes a tower, becomes more like a kind of log cabin in a sense, and the expression of its construction, the slotting together of it. But I think in all of them, there's a sort of like abstraction which happens that's a little bit like the kind of thing which happens with a doll's house, but clearly not like a doll's house at all. So like other interesting moments I found was the sort of the printing of wood effect onto aluminium to apply to a wood thing. That seems to me to be like an interesting way to begin to think about the aesthetics of wood as well as the kind of constructional kind of consequences. But yeah, for me, there's that question which comes straight from its material, fabrication, assembly qualities, which leads straight to questions of representation. I think it was, Hiroshi, I think it was yours where you were talking about, was it you talking about graffiti? I can't remember, but like basically the path of the path of the cutter, the path of the spray can, or the path of the pen, and there's an equivalence between all of those, which seems completely different to framing, as you guys clearly explained today. So that seems to me to be a real interest which comes out of a lot of the work which you've been looking at, which has been really fun to see.
I think the other beautiful thing is that timber is a very nostalgic and very homely material. It kind of reminds us a little bit of our holidays with our grandparents and kind of, you know, being away in the woods, to try and then apply it onto a scale that is kind of out of its comfort zone, let's say. It's something that has been very beautiful to see. And what I have personally enjoyed is the rhythm that the projects have had, the movement and the softness that the students have brought. I really loved Hiroshi's almost like quirky curtains. It feels like there's like a lot of nosy residents in that building trying to see out somehow. So it kind of brings that softness of the curtain of the home in the building. Or kind of Anna's scalloped surfaces, the fact that the timber is kind of not anymore this flat, the fact that these layers are laminated, it doesn't mean that it has to remain flat. It can have a rhythm and it can have a texture and it can be more sculptural and more textural. I think I have found this quite beautiful, and the playfulness, the fact that there are 7 completely different ideas here on the table, and I'm sure you have 7 more tomorrow to show, which is amazing. And I guess you almost like want to take it to the next level and not only think about the textures and the kind of how do you decorate the timber, bringing out the rhythm and the essence of the timber out of it, like Hiroshi did in his house. I think the udukuri method, for example, which was beautiful. I think it's about starting to think more about how these towers can be part of a city, the rhythm more specifically, the ground floors, the way that they change and they talk with the buildings around them. I think that it kind of feels like you have to continue doing this. You're not over. That's what I want to say. It's like a tiny beginning here.
But I wonder what those textures are, because I feel there's like there's tension. Sometimes it's very flat, and sometimes it's almost like a bundle of sticks. And you could say almost true also in the kind of sectional arrangements. You know, phrases like stacks and piles like become part of the language of construction at a bigger scale than they normally would. It feels interesting that there seems like different kind of tendencies within the work that we're looking at, maybe like different factions within the CLT fraternity.
Kirsten, you're from the CLT fraternity. You might have to come back on that.
You've come up with about in the office is that the timber construction at the moment or over the last 15 years has been like the start of the concrete revolution, the beginning of the last century, and we've been searching for a new aesthetic for how we can express CLT in its true form. And I think that what you've come up with, and I particularly enjoyed the stair with all the interconnecting joints, and for me as a very practical kind of CLT architect, you know, the way that you've looked at different ways of getting the loads to transfer through buildings has been a really interesting. I particularly loved the stacking boxes one. Sorry, I didn't catch your name, but I thought that was wonderful, the way that you've taken the actual panel size, but then reinterpreted it in a really beautiful way. I thought that there was a real rationality to that, which I enjoyed.
I think everybody has been really nice and congratulatory to this body of work, but I want to throw something out to the panelists that we've kind of been thinking about in the studio, which is a bit more critical. You know, at some point in the studio, all the students dropped their models into the 3D model and hit the render button. And it looked quite frightening in Raleigh to see all these wood mid-rise towers. And we kind of said, well, maybe it looks like brutalism. And, you know, have we done all this effort, you know, to try to rethink the materiality and the structure and this like innovation of a wood product? And are we still back to the same tropes of brutalism because of, you know, Kirsten, what you just said, like it kind of feels like the beginnings of concrete or tilt-up panels or precast or something. So yeah, just, I mean, I don't think you can get a sense of it from these representations because the students have like really rendered them in interesting ways and used color and other materials to kind of offset it. It'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, there's a really funny thing, isn't there, that if you go to, you know, brutalist building like National Theatre by Dennis Laston here in London, that what you're looking at is kind of wood. You know, you can see the rough hewn planks that we used for the formwork. So there is maybe some kind of weird relationship between the two. Maybe that's partly also the direct expression of a form of construction. You think too, like the original brutalism, Hunstanton School, was the Smithsons doing Mies basically, and didn't involve concrete, was steel and glass. So maybe there's something in the kind of rawness of saying the construction or qualities of the construction and the fabrication and the construction lead the direction of the project, that really direct relationship that inevitably produces, you know, maybe something like this. Because you could say, you know, the timber frame, which many of you were kind of referring to, like it does have qualities, but it also, you never really see it, you know. It maybe is the logic which produces the McMansion, because there's so many joints and there's so many like kind of elements to it, which CLT would resist, because you inevitably want it to be bigger and flatter, and you wouldn't want to do all those fiddly bits. In fact, it would make it much more difficult. I mean, just as an aside, there's something about the American frame which always reminds me of Andy Warhol and his quote about Coke. You know, like all the Cokes are the same and all the Cokes are good. Like all American houses are the same, whether you live in a shack or whether you live in a gigantic McMansion. They're the same thing, just scale changes. But that's an aside. But yeah, maybe there is an inherent brutalism to saying this is the way we're building it, and we're going to use that as the logic for, you know, what it produces.
I think what's interesting about your comment about the National Theatre is that you see the aesthetic of the timber, but they threw all that timber away, and actually what you're doing is, you know, the CLT brutalism, if you like, is actually retaining the actual kind of structural integrity of the material, which is and I think the thing with timber is that you only really appreciate its kind of it's the humanity of it, if you know what I mean. Like you were saying about, you know, it reminds us of going to visit our grandparents in the forest. You only experience that on the really close-up scale, and I think you know, that is which you don't experience with next to a concrete building. You don't get that sense that you get when you touch a piece of timber from, you know, when you're touching concrete. So I think there's maybe something about drilling down into the detail of these buildings a little bit more and understanding how they feel close up that could be really interesting to explore.
But I think brutalism was partly the material and partly kind of the bigger gestures of the volumes and the fact that the buildings felt really heavy. I think there is something quite beautiful about in some of the projects where the timber has tried to be even softer than the fact that you already know it's a softer material in your heart and in your brain. And I think it's the textures and the punctuations and the treatments on it that basically give you something a little bit more as you get closer to it. I think that's what's beautiful about it. The National Theatre, you can spot it from the bridge. We love it. Let's just be honest about it. But there isn't something more apart from the relationship that it has with the public realm, but the concrete is the concrete that you've seen 20 meters away. I think the nice thing here is that some of the students have tried to implement a sense of texture. Even Anna's kind of bandage thing, you have to go really close to then see the nails and all of the little things that are next to it. So the building keeps giving to you from an urban scale down to the actual personal kind of, you know, to building kind of moment.
I want to ask Mohsen a question. Sorry, Mohsen, did you want to say something?
No, I was just going to make one quick comment with regards to Jennifer's question, because I think a lot of, you know, it's been, people have responded to it in different ways. But one of the things that I think has been interesting today is the way in which you are clear about what the house is. But I think there's a kind of ambiguity about the tower, because the tower, sometimes you refer to it as mid-rise tower, sometimes you refer to it as the tower. And the question of like, what is a mid-rise tower versus a tower, or the difference between them, in terms of the materials of construction, and what is actually the kind of interiority of those things, difference between them. I think it would be interesting, because at the beginning you referred to the kind of Chicago effect and now this kind of CLT effect, but actually these buildings are also producing certain affects, not just the CLT effect. So I think the affectual conditions of these buildings is very different in the sense of what kind of apartment buildings, what sort of interiors, what sort of surface textures, which then touches on the real and fake or representational and tectonic discussions. And I think that's what maybe a lot of the conversation in some ways needs to go in that direction, to actually look more at the limitations essentially and the possibilities of a material, rather than just saying that, you know, CLT can make the tower. So I think this question of what it can't do, what is the limits of something, sizes of rooms, you know, the way that people will be able to make changes in the future, how much you can cut out. I think that's where the difference with concrete will come out in a way, when you get to a sort of slightly more the minutiae of things, of what is possible and what is not possible. Essentially, the discussion of limits, I think, would be a kind of interesting thing.
Mohsen, I agree. The presentation between the houses and the towers, something changes in the way that you're showing it, and for me that is to do with like representation, basically. Like you'll see much clearer. You know, this is what houses look like, and this is different from a house, or similar to a house, or an exaggeration of a house. So the question then, when you're making a tower, is like, kind of, what is that figure? That would be the question I'm asking, and that seems to sort of drop away a little bit and becomes more bound up in the kind of technique of construction. So I think that is a question I would think about, like what is a figure for a tower generally, a mid-rise tower generally, but then what might that be using this material? You could say, like, if you look at the early Chicago steel frame buildings, you know, what are they? They're kind of Italian palazzos with a base that stays the same, a top that stays the same, when they just kind of repeat the middle, which was clearly a kind of, you know, it was an idea of what that, you know, what that building type should look like. Strange one looking back on it, but definitely a very clear idea. So my question to you guys would be, what is that kind of like you'd say, that kind of the figure, the kind of cultural content of it, the relationship to the city that you can create, which you seem much stronger on when you're looking at houses, I would say.
And is it really what happens when you call what happens when you name something? Because when you say a tower, it already has a kind of visual resonance, and it has a history, and it has a precedent. So the fact is that with the CLT, to go from the house to tower, so that's like, I think that some naming has incredible consequences. Basically, that's
okay.
I think maybe just thinking about the uses within the tower, and maybe even applying a kind of view of what a post-COVID tower might look like. Sorry to use the word, but I think, you know, the idea is we're doing a project in Milan, and the developer is already thinking about how he could naturally ventilate his towers, and how we're going to make sure that there's enough distance between people, how that could actually impact on the way that we use these buildings, I think could also change the aesthetic.
I'd say Calvin's sort of characterization of the glass, the sort of typical glass tower as kitsch, that seems to be a really productive beginning to like how one might reinvent the tower, I have to say.
I also think that there's something nice about thinking of CLT not on its own as a material, because there's something about visiting buildings and seeing them in the city where there is a sequence of spaces and a sequence of feelings that you feel from walking from the outside into the lobby, taking the lift, arriving in your apartment or in your office. So composing materials or thinking about how things can come together, yes, CLT can be the bigger idea, and we can definitely look at how much it can do. But it's how do you find other things to partner with it and to start creating kind of different memories within those buildings, but also their relationship with the outside as well, and the neighboring buildings and the city, I think.
Katerina, I don't know if you want me saying this, but you live in the Barbican Center. So I feel like your comment's tied to your like daily routine of walking through the Barbican.
Where I just see one material. So I'm commenting on the fact that I'm missing a second one.
Does anybody from the students want to say anything?
Yeah, there's a lot here.
Yeah, somebody want to come say something? Mohsen did provoke how you worked through this in the last 7 weeks.
Just quickly, as always, I'm impressed by the jury. I mean, we all presented for about 3 minutes, which is nothing compared to the final review where we had like 10 minutes or more to explain a project, and to have people just pick up on a lot of the subtle things we were trying to do. It's really nice to see that there was kind of a clarity retained here. That's just my 2 cents.
Anyone else? So, I mean, I would just make a couple of comments. First of all, I think it's really good that you have created another set of tasks for us, all of us, meaning the students, Jennifer and I as well, in terms of how we might take this forward. I think it's wonderful to ask probably one reaction from Mohsen specifically, because he's seen a lot of innovations enter over the many years through many routes. So materials are one of the ways in which it enters. But how can we take this kind of, not the engineer-architect conversation, because that's a very old thing, but this way of actually working where probably half of the work is done off-site. We don't go and visit sites, and it's done on the computer largely. So just if you were able to say something, Mohsen, is that going to kill innovation or something like that?
I'm not quite sure, Hanif, exactly what you're asking, but a couple of things. One is that the architect-engineer discussion is actually not dead. it's time for us to sort of reinvent that or rethink that discussion. I think what you and Jennifer have been doing is working towards that. And by that I mean, I think we actually need closer conversations in terms of how ideas are tested and how a detailed understanding of certain materials, for example, contributes to their spatial and effectual consequences. I think these sorts of back and forth are very important, and often in a semester we don't get the chance to get into that level of detail. So what I think is very interesting about what has been done is the amazing level of sort of clarity between the scale of the house and the scale of tower and the level of kind of inventiveness. What that prevents you from doing is essentially to get into detail, to get into probably sort of, figuring some aspect of the project out in a lot more sort of, to the point where that kind of specificity of knowledge, whether it's to do with the discussion of surfaces or ornament or aspect of technology, actually becomes more revelatory. You find out something more about it. So there's a lot of incredible inventiveness at this stage, but I'm just wondering whether the next stage is not, one possibility is the stage of detail.